everyone talks about North Korea, of course, as this police state dictatorship, and that's why it's our enemy, right? And South Korea is our ally because it shares our Western values of democracy and freedom. Do you agree with that?
Until the late 1980s, South Korea was a pretty dark dictatorship too, and the United States supported a succession of police states there. After Syngman Rhee was overthrown, there was about 1 year of a somewhat progressive government in 1960 to 61 that wanted to start talking about unification. It wasn't that far after the division and the terrible impact of the Korean War. But 1961, there's a military coup. Park Chung-hee, former general trained by the Japanese imperial forces, he took over as the military dictator in South Korea, and we supported that government until his assassination in 1979 with huge amounts of military aid. Pak government supported the U.S., sent troops to Vietnam to back the U.S. war in southern Vietnam. And so, we had this relationship with a succession of dictatorial governments in the South. And the Park Chung-hee government talking about, talk about a police state, talk about a surveillance state, talk about a torture state, and yet we poured, hundreds of millions of dollars into supporting them and against the will of the Korean people. And there was another military coup in 1980 that was, another general took over after Park was killed. And, he took power by killing hundreds of people in the southwestern city of Gwangju. And, even when there was an uprising against that military coup, against martial law forces, the U.S. Worked with the Korean military to put down the uprising. And, this was really shocking to a lot of South Koreans, and people felt very betrayed. And they finally stood up and won their democracy in the late 1980s, 1987, 1988. So, until then, that whole myth was not applicable. But I think the reason that we're in the United States still has massive amounts of military forces in South Korea is not just North Korea. Most of the U.S. bases in Japan are in Okinawa, and those are seen as forward bases for the U.S. to project power in Asia and throughout the world, really. So the rationale has sort of changed.
I was going to ask, the enemy of the state laws and kind of the repression of political dissidents, are those holdovers from these military dictatorships that you were talking about?
Yeah, they are. South Korea has a law called the National Security Law, under which if you say anything that sounds like it's what North Korea says, you can be jailed, and you can be jailed for having North Korean literature. You can be jailed for traveling there without authority from the South Korean government, and so lots of people have been persecuted under this national security law. In the past, it was used as a way to just stifle dissent, period. And lots of people during the Park period, Park Chung-hee, and Chun Doo-hwan period were executed under the national security law. There was lots of trumped up charges just on this loose law that said, if you say anything that's close to what North Korea says, you're a communist and you're a pro-North Korean, therefore you're to be prosecuted. Under Park Chung-hee, there was cases of, there'd be a group of people that might have studied Marxism or something, and they would like, all 30 of them, they would charge them all with anti-state, on violations of the national security law.
Horrific.
Many of those people back in the 70s were executed. And, people spend decades in prison under this law, and this law is still in place. And a lot of people in South Korea feel like South Korea can't really be a truly democratic country until it gets rid of this law. And under the national security law, even after you're released from prison, you have to report to the police once or twice a year, and you have to tell them everything that you did that might violate the national security law, and also anyone you know that may have violated the national security law.
North Korea, of course, or the DPRK, is a country that essentially the media can say anything about it, and people believe it because it's so closed off, right? And I've heard stories, everything from mass, cannibalization to Kim Jong-un, who has his forces just execute people who aren't crying hard enough at military parades. It's comical, the amount of disinfo. Do you care to debunk any common misconceptions about the country?
Well, the most common misperception is that the leadership is crazy and irrational.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing crazy and irrational about trying to defend your country from what you consider to be a military force that's out to destroy you. I mean, that's totally rational. And I think building nuclear weapons, when you look out at the world and you see what happened, say, when in Libya to Gaddafi, when he gave up his nuclear program, and then a few years later, U.S. and NATO, displaced him in a war, and put in a government that's completely chaotic now, and he sees this happening when he, to a leader who did give up his weapons. Well, that's even more of a reason. People in North Korea have the same kind of wants and desires that people all over the world do. To live in safety and to have a good health system and to have jobs and income and water and food, everything. The people are no different, North and South Korea. There's no reason to gloss over the nature of the authoritarian state in North Korea, because it's present. We know that there's many political prisoners, but the country has developed over time. It's come back from, it was pretty much destroyed in the Korean War. They have pride in their economic developments. I mean, this is a country that was destroyed at one point. Within 20 years, it had a very flourishing economy. And North Korea had a kind of interesting history as a socialist country, because it didn't, it had this philosophy of Kim Il-sung's philosophy was, self-reliance, called Juche, and developed their own self-sufficient economy. And so they didn't want to be integrated into the world market. So North Korea developed their own, industry, without being dependent on any one country. And they were very proud of it, and you can see the fact that, a country that can develop a nuclear weapon and also develop very sophisticated missiles is not a backward country. Mm-hmm. And they maintain a certain degree of independence from all their allies. The other critical thing that Americans really need to know is that that's, yes, it's their country. It was split arbitrarily. It should never have been split. Dean Rusk, who was a low-level State Department guy, walked into a room and looked at a map of Korea and saw the 38th parallel on a map, a National Geographic map, and said, we'll divide it right there. And so it was completely arbitrary, and there was supposed to be, a unified Korea after that, and that was just supposed to be temporary. But, it didn't turn out to be that way.
Let's move on to the Korean War. When I grew up in school, you hear about World War I, World War II, Vietnam, of course, but you don't really learn much about this war. It's called the Hidden War for a reason, but we're nonetheless taught that the U.S. was forced to respond because of this invasion of the South by the North. What really happened?
Well, the origins of the Korean War go back to that division in 1945. Throughout the country, there had been, sort of these people committees were formed throughout the country, North and South, right after the division, because people want to have a unified Korea. In the North, they were recognized as legitimate organizations, these people's committees. In the South, right away, the U.S. sided with people put in power, people who had collaborated with the Japanese colonialists, Korean police who had been trained by and used by the Japanese colonialists as police. These are the people who were running the government and running the police. And the U.S. saw these people's committees as communist inspired and would not allow them to operate. And so he drove a lot of the sort of pro-independence, pro-unification forces, underground, and eventually it became in the South in the late 40s. There was like civil war basically throughout the South. Leftists fighting against this right-wing government. And 1947, for example, on the southern island of Jeju, the largest island in Korea, the whole island voted. There was a plebiscite in 1948 where the whole island voted against dividing the country, which the President Syngman Rhee wanted to do. And right away, there was a small revolt against the occupiers of the island, who were these police who had collaborated with the Japanese. And the U.S. immediately saw this as some communist-inspired revolt, declared the whole island Red Island, and oversaw a counterinsurgency campaign in which 30 to 40,000 people were killed. So, all this kind of led up to the formation of two different states. First, South Korea declared itself Republic of Korea. And then after that, North Korea formed the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, after there was an official South Korea formed. And there was tensions along the border. And, 1950, June 1950, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, decided the time was ripe to, in his view, to liberate the whole country from the U.S. And then they made a decision, Truman made a decision to actually send U.S. forces and South Korean forces north and to occupy the north. To roll back communism, that was the idea then. And the problem with not having a democracy in South Korea is that this story has been covered up, how this came to be, until the late 80s. People couldn't even know their own history. And then, like I was saying before, under this national security law, if you started, retelling the history and it sounded like North Korean history, you could be arrested under the national security law. So it's really difficult to even come to grips with your own history there.
The death and destruction caused by the U.S. empire in the Korean War, what were the targets, tactics, and how many people were killed?
It's hard to say how many people were killed. I mean, I've heard upwards of 3 million civilians were killed. I think 3 to 4 million Koreans were killed. But they bombed everything they could bomb. I mean, they would strafe, railroad, anything moving on the ground, railroads, trucks, anything like that. Everything was open to blow up. And they dropped, millions and millions of barrels of napalm. I mean, they really perfected the use of napalm in Korea, in northern Korea. And so they just, they would just attack towns and villages. Everything was considered, enemy territory. So it was up for bombing. And they would just bomb everything they possibly could. And there was, towards the end of the war, the U.S. Air Force actually stopped sending sorties because there was no targets left. I mean, it was really completely flattened. And, the U.S. was actually thinking of they came very close to dropping nuclear weapons on North Korea. And General MacArthur was finally removed from his command, in part because he wanted to nuke 20 Chinese cities,
And people say today the DPRK is obsessed with its military might, right? It keeps building up the military, and it seems like there's a direct correlation to the complete devastation. I mean, 30% of its population.
They remember that. It's part of their national mythology. I mean, we have our Civil War, we have our Revolutionary War, they have the Korean War, and they would consider it a war of liberation. And they did, with the help of the Chinese, kick the U.S. out of the North. So, they don't want that to ever happen again. And yeah, that's part of their national psyche.
So let's go back. I mean, the Trump administration is so belligerent, but let's go back to the Clinton administration. There was an agreement that ended up freezing its nuclear program for 12 years.
Right.
So what was that agreement, and then how did Bush muck it up?
Well, so in the late 1980s, North Korea under Kim Il-sung started looking at having nuclear weapons. And part of the reason was because until 1991, the U.S. had nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, hundreds of them. These kind of handheld weapons that U.S. soldiers would carry. Their nuclear weapons had hundreds of them in South Korea. And of course, the U.S. 7th Fleet is in Yokosuka, Japan, and very close to Korea. And there's ships there that have nuclear arms, planes. And Okinawa, the U.S. bases are there. And so they saw, building a nuclear capability was a way of defending themselves. They had signed the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And when they decided to proceed in a nuclear program, they pulled out of the NPT. And to that pulling out of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty was like a red line for the U.S. And actually, the Clinton administration seriously considered a nuclear strike on the Yongbyon facilities at the time. They came very close to it, and there was a lot of talk of war. It was just like there is, just like today. People might remember, Jimmy Carter went to North Korea, flew to North Korea, met with Kim Il-sung, and they hammered out what became this agreed framework under which North Korea agreed to end its nuclear program, stop its production of plutonium at this plant. And so when Bush took over in 2001, with all these neocons in his government, like John Bolton and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, were against this agreement, any agreement with North Korea. In his State of the Union address, Bush labeled North Korea as part of the axis of evil with Iran and Iraq. So this was like the last straw for the North Koreans. They said, okay, we now see that you believe we're back in enemy status. And so they pulled out of the agreement themselves and started proceeding on their plutonium program. And by 2006, they had built their first atomic weapon and tested their first weapon in 2006.
Negotiations, didn't they start later on during the Bush administration, and then it was Obama that actually completely, again, destroyed them?
2005, there was a declaration by South and North Korea, U.S., Japan, China, and Russia that Korea itself would not be nuclear, would not allow nuclear weapons, North or South. All the countries agreed to that. That agreement with the 5 countries had been violated by the U.S. because at the time the U.S. was still imposing, sanctions kept being imposed. And when Obama came in 2009, he and his people sort of had this idea that somehow the problem of North Korea would go away because it was going to collapse. And they did not want to negotiate directly with North Korea. So even, Bush was willing to have direct talks with them. Obama was not. Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, and he had, of course, given up his nuclear weapons. And they figured, well, nuclear weapons and a powerful military is our only protection against this happening to us.
But representatives have said that they would never strike first, right? And also that this whole history proves that they're willing to negotiate away their nuclear program under certain conditions. So it just seems to contradict the claim that we hear continuously from the U.S., which is this is all about stopping North Korea from having nukes.
Right. It may be too late to stop them from having nukes. I mean, they have nukes. I mean, they're nuclear power. Right. They have them, and they have obviously really, well-developed missile program. Look, they see themselves surrounded. And of course, the U.S. has a very powerful military in the South. But I mean, U.S. military is in alliance with the South Korean military, which is a very, very powerful military in itself, and Japan's. Constant war games, constant, ratcheting up the tensions. North Korea, and what's kind of interesting when you look at the so-called threats from each side, like you hear Trump say, fire and fury like the world has never seen before, like bringing up images of, that's what Truman said before he dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, the second bomb, right? Similar kinds of words, but it's basically, we're going to inflict a Holocaust on you. And then you look at their threats. America was all shocked when they said they might test some missiles by firing them towards Guam. Why Guam? Well, that's where these B-1 bombers are based, where these B-1 bombers fly regular missions from there over Korean skies. They have massive amounts of firepower on those planes. I mean, they're bunker buster bombs, all kinds of munitions that could blow half the cities of North Korea sky high. So the U.S. keeps saying we're ready to annihilate you, and they say, well, we might fire a missile towards Guam, where this so their threats tend to be more particularized towards a U.S. base.
And it's all you see all day over the news. What are we going to do? This missile was launched. It's just nuts.
And like the U.S. media never looks at it from their point of view. What is it like to hear like your country may be annihilated? Annihilation means everybody's dead. There's 25 million people in North Korea. So what, we're going to kill 25 million people to prevent them from having one nuclear weapon without even talking to them?
How does this type of rhetoric resonate with South Koreans and the administration?
Well, it scares the hell out of people in South Korea because people are there. Actually, when I was there in April and May, people there are far more worried about what Trump might do than what Kim Jong-un would do. They're used to these kinds of, tensions with North Korea. South Koreans, when they hear Trump talking about fire and fury, I guess Trump doesn't realize that thousands and thousands of South Koreans have relatives in North Korea. Their families are. He's talking about their families, maybe their grandfather, their great-grandfather, their brother. So when he's talking about destroying the entire North Korean people, he's talking about destroying their own relative, and they see it as one country, and they don't see it in this divisive way that so many of our leaders do here, and I might add, in both parties, Democrat, Republican, they're the same. You hear the same hawkish stuff from both sides.
And a complete dehumanization of North Koreans, as if they're all just robots who hypnotically following and worshiping their dear leader. They're human beings. They're human beings.
Because instead of seeing them as just these demonic, crazy people, we should see them as human beings with hopes and dreams for their country like anybody else, and try to reach some common ground with them.
Many in the U.S. establishment are arguing for a major war, as we're talking about, which would no doubt trigger just death and destruction, on a horrific scale. What would that look like for Korea, U.S. soldiers, and if regime change was successfully led by the U.S., what do you think would replace the regime?
So the U.S., you read like this CNN story the other day from Barbara Starr. It was just a shill for the Pentagon. She talks about a 1-month war. They go in there and somehow take out their missile sites and take out nuclear sites. Obviously that in itself would kill tens of thousands of people. But, North Korea, if they're attacked, they're going to fire back. They're not going to take this lying down. So, an attack on Korea could generate not only counterattack on South Korea, but a counterattack on Japan. It would be a regional war, but there's a lot of people in the U.S. military that know how destructive a war would be in Korea. Anyone who's served there, mountainous country, and the people, they know the North Korean army, would put up a hell of a fight. And they know that the cost would be millions of lives, and I think that's the one factor that's maybe holding back U.S. Trump and his people. But now they're talking. They keep talking about the military option. War is. To me, it's just obscene to be talking about war as an option when it could kill, millions of people. I guess Senator Lindsey Graham just says that's people over there. It's not going to bother. It's only those Asian people are going to get killed. Even Japan, but so what? We're not there. But tens of thousands of Americans could get killed too. And as far as your second question, what I know from when I've been following these sort of regime changes here, these people, the RAND Corporation, for example. Bruce Bennett, who's a specialist at the RAND Corporation, who thinks that, the target should be Kim Jong-un.
Worked closely on the interview with Seth Rogen.
Exactly, and helped that movie, helped with the end of the movie where they blew his head apart. And said that was a good idea to keep that in. Well, their model is to have the sort of U.S.-induced regime change from within, like they're going to somehow win over all these North Korean elites, to somehow go along with some kind of U.S. plan, to have a U.S.-backed government in North Korea, overthrow their government. And when you read carefully what they have to say and hear what they have to say, it's like South Korea isn't even part of their discussion. And there was a sort of rumor that got into a story. Some reporter picked up some intelligence from some counterinsurgency people in Washington who are, consultants and contractors, and they were saying, "Oh, well, we're talking to the Trump administration about, doing a counterinsurgency in North Korea." I mean, these people are nuts. They don't know anything about Korea. I mean, the idea that somehow the U.S. is going to go in there and direct this regime change in North Korea, and everything's going to be, we're going to have a pro-U.S. government there, and everything's going to be fine, is the same kind of mentality as the United States had in 1945, which is, we know what's best for Korea, and we're going to determine it, and we don't give a damn what you Koreans think. It's exactly the same mentality, and somehow, we in America have to learn the real history.